Good morning and welcome to the webinar. My name is Jeanette Stanziano and I am the Education and Training Director for NYSAC. I'd like to welcome you today to our very first county finance virtual program. We have a lot of people on the call. There's a lot of interest in this topic, coronavirus relief funds, federal stimulus aid to counties to date. Just a couple of housekeeping bits before we start. I'd like to tell you that your dashboard is your friend today. Please click on the handouts portion of your dashboard. If you would like to download, there are two documents that you can download. One is a link from one of our speakers. She will mention the link during her presentation, and that's Angela Cole from Suffolk County. And then there's also a form from the State Comptroller's Office for the CPE credits. You can download this form and keep it if you're attending any other county finance school webinars during the next month and a half. You only need one form, and there's a checkbox with a listing of all of the webinars. Just check off the ones that you've attended, and then there are instructions on the form on where to send your form to achieve those credits. Just to let you know, OSC has upped the number of possible credits that you can make. Instead of 11, if all of our programs run the full course, which is an hour and 15 minutes, you actually can get up to 16.5 credits, which is very exciting, especially for a no-fee program. So let's begin. I first want to thank our sponsor today, and that's James McGinnis and Associates, Inc. This particular company has been associated with NYSAC for many years, and we're very happy to have them supporting this program this morning. James McGinnis and Associates, grant administration and time accounting systems, and they provide features. Excuse me, I have a little blocking here. Features like eHIPS integration, easily customizable activity codes, and push-button reporting for grant claiming and Article 6 state aid that make compliance with federal, state, and grantor requirements a snap. If your county is looking to reduce the burden of grant administration, time and compliance, or Article 6 state aid reporting, we can help. I just have a short video welcome from our sponsor that I'd like to play for you now, and then we will begin. Sharing.
Hello, I'm Peter Bombard from James McGinnis & Associates. Thank you to NYSAC for the opportunity to sponsor this webinar, and thank you for your time. You'll likely know of us from our preschool software that is currently in 45 counties in New York State. What you may not know is that we also provide many other services to governments, including software consulting. The theme that runs through everything we do is productivity leveraged through the application of technology. Our focus is on helping you make the most of your limited staff resources by using technology to improve productivity. So whether you are looking to add value to your existing systems, supplement your current technical staff, ease the burden of regulatory compliance, or gain new insights into your operations, we can help. Gratis allows you to manage, capture, and report on employee time, effort, and mileage in conjunction with grant expenditures. This allows you to reduce the burden of grant administration, time and effort compliance, and Article 6 state aid reporting. Features include user-friendly time and effort collection and reporting, eHIPS time and effort import, digital signatures for timesheets and approvals, immediate simple configuration to add new categories, payroll and ledger imports, push-button grant claiming and Article 6 state aid data generation, New York State DOH compliant time and effort reporting, an audit-proven system, and our ongoing maintenance includes updates for new state aid submission requirements. Learn more about Gratis at www.jmcginnis.com/gratis, or call or email us to schedule a demo to see for yourself how Gratis can help. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much. And now I would like to introduce Dave Lucas. Dave is NYSAC's Director of Finance and Intergovernmental Affairs. He is our finance expert in our office, among other things. And so, Dave, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. And I want to welcome everybody that's joining us today. This is the opening session for our 55th consecutive county finance school. Unfortunately, we're not able to meet in person this year, as was the case last year, but I'm hoping next year will be different. To provide education and training to so many county officials. And this is the first of 11 workshops that we're going to have for County Finance School. And as Jeanette said, there's CPE credits for those county officials that need to keep up on those continuing education credits. So this is the first one, and we'll end near the end of May. We are going to have a few workshops that deal with federal stimulus. This is the first one, and this really is kind of a look back at what happened over the last year. Some counties did get direct federal assistance, the larger counties over population over 500,000. So we want to hear from them about their experience today. And also, I think there's going to be some crossover into the new American Rescue Plan funds that all counties are going to receive. You know, I think people are looking at it from the perspective of things Treasury has already approved under the coronavirus relief funds, or the CRF funds, as I'll refer to them, will continue under the ARP funding. So I think it's good background to provide and get a sense of the process and things that these counties set up. So I'm going to spend a few minutes up front just talking about a little bit about CRF was. We have a short little message at ARP right here. Thanks, Jeanette, for switching the slide. Last night, this is a special announcement related to the American Rescue Plan. And I think every county meets this standard, but they just basically mentioned last night that the first thing counties need to do is make sure your DUNS number is set up and you're in the SAM database and everything's working there. I would believe that every county out there is fine on this. So, but this was announced last night. If there is any problems here, there's some contact information here. And they do point out, next slide, please, that, you know, if something's not working here, it could delay funding for 2 to 3 weeks. And again, on ARP, next slide, please. This is just more information. And we have heard from NACO and some of our federal contacts that, you know, we could start seeing some guidance in the next 3 to 4 weeks from Treasury. And as a reminder, Treasury has 60 days from enactment to start getting the funds out the door. But they do have some time, I believe, after that, based on when you submit your certification, when those funds start flowing on the ARP. So now I'm going to jump into the regular programming here after that special announcement. Next slide. Just background, so the coronavirus relief funds were part of one of the earlier stimulus bills that passed, I believe this one passed last March, and it provided funding to counties over 500,000 or any jurisdiction over 500,000. And here you see a list. New York State got about 5.1 billion, New York City 1.4, and you can see down the list. And you know, we have on the call today, we have Erie County who's going to be presenting, Suffolk County, and Westchester, not necessarily in that order, but they will all be talking about their own experience here. Next slide, please. Now, the CRF Treasury provided guidance, and I think the counties will talk a little bit more about this. I have the hindsight with me here, so I can talk about the guidance that Treasury put out, but I think you'll hear from our county officials. The initial guidance was a lot narrower for the CRF funds when they started, and it evolved over time. So I have the ability to look back at here as I present it, but as the county started their spending on CRF and what they could use their funds for, there was a very different focus, and there was even a different time limit. And so they had to switch gears quickly in this process. And I think under ARP, we're going to have the same process. We're going to get initial guidance, and it's going to be refined. the CRF guidance right now is the real Bible, I think, for the CRF counties has been the FAQs that Treasury puts out. And they're now up to 85 questions that run about 30 pages in FAQs. People send in questions and Treasury answers them. And some of them are multiple part answers. So there's quite a bit of guidance out there, but it changed over time. So just something you need to recognize about the guidance. It's not going to be everything you need to know the first day when the ARP funds arrive. And I think these counties will talk about their experience with CRF. So the initial guidance for CRF, and they talked about any necessary expenditures incurred to the public health emergency related to COVID, expenses that were not accounted for in the budget, and these are underlying these two things here because they're defined in the next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, the necessary expenditure was defined as addressing of medical or public health need, as well as expenditures respond to second order effects, providing support for the unemployed, business interruption, etc. And I think the county officials will talk more about this as, what is determined as necessary. They have a definition in the guidance that says reasonably necessary for its intended use in the reasonable judgment of the government officials responsible for spending that fund. I don't know if that's vague and unhelpful, but there's a lot of reasonable interpretation that would be provided. Also, costs not accounted for in the budget. The cost cannot lawfully be funded using a line item, allotment, or allocation within the budget, or the cost is for a substantially different use from any expected use of funds of such line, allotment, or allocation. And a cost is not considered, this is a note, to be covered or accounted for in a plan if you had a rainy day fund. So the existence of a rainy day fund in and of itself did not mean you had the ability to fund something for using CRF funds. Next, please. And these are just some examples, and folks will get into this more about what they did, but you could cover medical expenses if you had medical facilities, treatment, testing, emergency management response, training, telemed, public health, all the public health communication, the quarantining, food assistance, homeless assistance, payroll. There's some nuance in this area, and I think folks will talk more about that. You could cover payroll costs when someone is substantially dedicated to mitigating and responding to the COVID-19 emergency, and this is across all your county programs. There is a difference in the CRF funds and the ARP funds, which needs to be defined in the future Treasury guidance. Under ARP, pension costs could be covered as a benefit for the employee. In ARP, there is a designation in the law that says you can't make a deposit into a pension fund. So Treasury is going to have to clarify that in this regard. Next, please. And again, on payroll, it talks about substantially different use and defines that. And Treasury did, over time, make a special exemption for public health and public safety personnel. They called it administrative accommodation, and they just deemed that everything these workers did was in response to COVID. This is which will be the first question to folks when they get on the line. When this guidance was drafted, they talked about an end date of December 30th, 2021, but we do know that was extended. Next, please. And again, economic support, as we talked about, was an eligible use. And they do line out some definite ineligible costs, damages for insurance, payrolls for staff not substantially dedicated to COVID, anything that would or could be that will be reimbursed by another federal program, reimbursement for donated items, severance pay, legal settlements, and as I mentioned, ARP adds a limitation on pension costs, and also the ARP funds can't be used to pay for a tax cut. Again, this would need to be defined by Treasury. So next, I think we'll turn it over. Next slide. So we're going to turn it over to Larry Soul. He's a budget director in Westchester County, and he's going to talk a little bit about his experience And again, as Jeanette mentioned, if something is said here and you have a question, just punch it into the chat line there. Thank you. Larry? Are you there, Larry? Larry? You may be muted.
Yes, he's self-muted.
No.
Oh, there we go. Clear.
There we go. I wasn't self-muted initially, but okay. So thank you, Dave. Appreciate it. Yeah, so as Dave mentioned, when this was first enacted, the CRF, the CARES Act, the guidance was extremely limited. In this slide here, I just outlined the various major relief programs. The initial one, Family First, which was the increase, major impact directly for the counties, was the increase in the FMAP percentage. And then CRF was passed on March 27, 2020. And I just want to clarify one thing, that the Act actually said you had to spend the funds by December 30th, 2020. Why they did the 30th, I'm not sure. So I know that because that's what kept me up at night, trying to figure out how we were going to spend all this money by December 30th, given the limited restrictions on the allowable use. That was later extended, however, as Dave had mentioned. I think go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so we received $168.8 million. We received it in one wire in early April. And so one of the major things in the CARES Act for the CRF funds is that it could not be used for revenue replacement. They were very clear on that. However, that was, as you know, one of the county's, ours as well as I'm sure everyone else's biggest issue was the drop in the sales tax in April and May. And it couldn't be used for anything that was currently appropriated in your budget. So that was a bit of a challenge. While we were incurring certainly additional expenses related to the pandemic, it wasn't to the tune of $169 million. So that posed, a bit of a challenge. And so the first, thing that we did was to try to develop a plan in terms of how we were going to spend this money. And so that plan had to be flexible because there were other sources of funding. There was FEMA that we could apply for. So essentially, we wanted to maximize, all sources of state, federal aid. As was mentioned earlier, thankfully, the guidance was made more flexible. It seemed like it was changing every couple of weeks, and I have a feeling that's probably why they're waiting to release the guidance, so they kind of try to get it right the first time. And the big game changer, I think, for us was when they made that administrative accommodation, essentially saying that we could, that public safety would be deemed to be substantially dedicated to addressing the pandemic. And that public safety included, and I think they specifically outlined this, police, but also corrections as well, which is one of our largest, and I'm sure for a lot of counties, largest expenses after social services. So that was really the game changer for us. And then, we did, so initially what was important was, I think, to identify who the key person is, or the point person in your organization who's going to be overseeing the relief funds. And this not only included the CRF, but included FEMA. Normally FEMA would be handled by our Department of Emergency Services, but because this was not, a traditional disaster, obviously, they were still engaged in addressing it. Typically when there's a storm, the storm happens, and then afterwards there's the cleanup, and then they deal with FEMA. So they didn't really have the resources to do that. So we've been overseeing the FEMA claims as they relate specifically to the pandemic. And, clearly you cannot, as everyone knows, double dip with federal funds. So we needed to try to figure out, what's the best use of FEMA versus the CARES Act. I mean, and that's really, once they expanded the guidance, we realized we had more expenses than what, the CARES Act would reimburse. So we wanted to look at those items that FEMA would be able to, we would be able to apply for, and what we were calling more low-hanging fruit, but there's really no such thing with FEMA because, as everyone knows, we're still waiting for reimbursement on Superstorm Sandy expenses. So we have yet to be approved for any of our FEMA projects, but we are pretty far along on that. And we're also claiming vaccine administration under FEMA. So it was a balancing act. And plus, with the guidance, changing constantly, it was a bit of a challenge. But so I think it's important to have one person that's appointed overseeing and coordinating all these various programs. So I think what the other important thing is, make sure you have sufficient resources, whether that includes hiring an outside consultant. We were approached by a number of consultants, which, I think for us may have been more important for FEMA, because I think at that point in time, everyone was kind of just trying to figure this out, And so we decided to handle it in-house, and I was able to hire an additional person in my department that was specifically dedicated to this. So next slide, please. Okay, so the key is, put a plan together. How are you going to spend the funds? Balance budgetary relief. Under the ARP, you can use the funds for revenue replacement, whereas under, the CARES Act, you could not. However, that being said, with the administrative accommodation they made, essentially we were paying for expenses that otherwise would have been paid for the revenue. So it really, with the revenue loss, so it essentially gets you to the same place, because I think they realized early on people weren't going to be able to spend this money with the, guidance that was initially issued. And I'm not making the leap, though, that they're going to continue to say public safety and corrections are substantially dedicated. I think there may, in my opinion, be a slightly different philosophy on that. So, one of the things that'll be a little bit of a challenge for us is that we had a sales tax increase in 2019. And so you have to demonstrate that you had a revenue reduction compared to the previous fiscal year prior to the onset of the pandemic. So that would be 2019. Our sales tax increase didn't happen until August. So even though we're down versus plan, we were up year over year. So the way it's written in the law, it doesn't seem to have a lot of wiggle room, but we presented that question to, there's a number of questions that have been presented to Treasury that hopefully will be addressed in the guidance. And then one of the other things that we had to do was there was a certification that was required to be submitted to Treasury from your county executive or chief executive officer, certifying that the money would be spent in accordance with the act. In ARP, that appears to only apply to states. And so I think we're trying to get clarification on some of the items that appear to only apply to states that, they may carry over to local governments as well. And the other one is the, I don't want to get too much into the ARP, but the limitation on reducing taxation directly or indirectly from the use of the funds. So it has to be a balance, like how much do you need for budgetary relief and how much do you want to spend on programmatic initiatives? I mean, we wanted to keep some of our powder dry because we didn't know. It was uncertain. So we did develop a lot of programs, and you can always add money to these programs later. We started out a little bit conservatively, small business assistance. We started at, I think it was, 5 million. Eventually, we provided over 18 million of assistance in the form of grants to small businesses. I imagine that will be something we will continue, maybe more targeted under ARP in terms of looking at hospitality and tourism that, has been, more impacted perhaps than some other businesses. And then there was food distribution to address food insecurity. We worked with a number of not-for-profits throughout the county to expand on food distribution. And then we did do our own rental assistance program, but now we didn't, don't need to use that money because there's specific money dedicated to rental assistance. We received about $23 million so far. And then we also, there were a number of other initiatives, but one of the major ones, we implemented remote learning centers for especially for children of first responders, healthcare workers, et cetera. And then, you know, the key thing is, how are you going to deliver these services? If you want to do small business assistance, for example, we didn't have the staff in-house to administer this, so we hired an outside not-for-profit to administer it. And I think it's important to make sure when you enter into these contracts that you specify, you know, the record-keeping aspect of it, because while, and I'll get a little bit more into the reporting later, you report, at least under the CARES Act, it was reported at a very high level. And they were kind of, you know, leaving it up to you to determine what level of documentation you would maintain at the local level. And that's important to the extent OIG would come in and do a desk audit. You need to be prepared to have the backup information that supports that this money was spent in accordance with the act. So we ended up using a not-for-profit. You need to make sure, you know, your contract specifies the record retention, and are they going to provide it to you in electronic format, and make sure the contract, you know, provides for that. And the plan has to be flexible, as I said, with the guidance changing and additional needs arising. You need to be able to make, you know, adjustments. And so I wouldn't, you know, you want to be careful perhaps not to dedicate it all to outside programs if you think you need, you know, you may need more to address budgetary issues. And as I had mentioned, one goal was to maximize the state, federal aid, and FEMA relief. And I think even Department of Health has issued guidance that you must claim, if it's Article 6 eligible expense, you have to claim that first, which I'm not sure why you wouldn't want to do that and use that money first before you use your, you know, federal grant money. And then, you know, if the good thing is that under the reporting, and I'll get into that, which is quarterly, you can change. If you're claiming funds under the CRF and the reporting is still going on because it was extended, you can change what you reported in a prior period. If you decide, okay, I'm going to claim this under FEMA, or there's a different grant or source of funding for that expense, you can change what you reported in an earlier period, and you basically enter it in as a negative to zero it out or reduce it, whatever the case is. Next slide. Okay, so, and then the key thing is, what the first thing we did, and maybe I did this sort of a little bit out of order here, but I put these together rather quickly, but establish how you're going to track the expenditures. And the first thing, whenever we have a disaster here, and I'm sure a lot of you do the same thing, we set up special event codes for payroll. We set up special object codes to track the expenses. So we did that from the very beginning, and, you know, make sure the departments are all aware, you know, that they need to do this. So we continued, even before we continued to track these expenses into this year, before we even knew the ARP was going to be approved. And so we, you know, tracked straight time. We tracked, you know, if someone was normally performing a different function, but was now, and that's how you know, we linked in the substantially dedicated, but now they were dedicated to dealing with the pandemic. We tracked their time, and we said, we're going to claim that. If someone had to be out quarantined or was out because of COVID, we tracked that separately, and we claimed that. And so, you know, that's important. We established special codes for not just payroll, but for materials, supplies, contractual services. So any PPE we bought, whenever those contracts or purchase orders were done, we tracked it against the COVID expense codes. We also subsequently established special sub-object codes for vaccine administration. We were aware that the state received money for vaccine administration. I mean, we're not optimistic that we'll get any of that money, but we wanted to track that to the extent there was a specific dedicated bucket of money for vaccine administration costs. We are currently claiming those under FEMA and working with State Homeland Security, but I can tell you that it's, you know, as you know, once you think you're close, you find out you're not really close. There's another hoop you have to jump through to claim it. So, and again, if you find out later, okay, FEMA is not going to approve this project, you could switch it over and claim it under the, we could claim it under the CARES Act. So we did make a number of changes, you know, in each of the quarterly reporting periods. Next slide, please. Okay, so initially, how did we book the money that we received, the $169 million? We booked it as deferred revenue, and I'm not a CPA, so I apologize if I'm using the wrong terminology here, but we booked it as deferred revenue on our balance sheet upon receipt. And as we identified eligible expenses, we recognize an equivalent amount of the CRF funds as federal revenue. We will end up, as we're working on closing our books out for 2020, and we actually just issued the quarterly report that was due, I think, April 12th, thereabouts. We reported 100% of the funds being spent as 2020 expenses. So we will recognize 100% of that revenue in 2020. And I felt it was important that we kind of put that behind us so we can focus on the next bucket of money that we'll be receiving. Next slide. Okay, so there's, as I mentioned, there's quarterly reporting. It's in the Grant Solutions portal. There were a number of training sessions in terms of how to utilize that. I believe they're going to be using the same system. And so, as I said, this is done on a high level, but they expect you to maintain the sufficient documentation at the local level to support that the spending was done appropriately. For the CRF, reporting of subrecipients receiving less than $50,000 was in the aggregate, so we didn't need to report each individual. So, for example, when we contracted with a not-for-profit for the small business assistance, that payment we made to them, they basically distributed the individual grants, was reported as one contract with them. We did not need to report each of the individual businesses receiving the funding. However, what is important though is we're requiring the not-for-profit and the scope of their contract changed because I don't think they were quite aware they were going to be doing this level of work. So that's why I said it's important to make sure that the scope of the contract incorporates this. Tracking and there's certifications that come from each of the businesses and so forth because they had to demonstrate or at least certify that they were impacted by the pandemic. And then, as I said, if you determine later that a payment you reported in a previous period, you're going to cover it from a different source, then you can revise your report in a subsequent reporting period up until, obviously, the last reporting period. And then, next slide, please. And maybe that's the last slide. So I think, there's a lot. That's a very high level, discussion of what we experienced. So I would say, I certainly what was helpful, I think, was being able to talk to other counties and not only in New York, but, to see what they were doing. And some people took a little more conservative approach and others, were a little bit more liberal in terms of their interpretation of the rules. But I guess that's it for me. And certainly I know there'll probably be questions later.
Thank you so much, Larry. Our next set of speakers is Erie County. We have Bob Keating as the budget director, and I think his deputy, Ben Swanekamp, and hopefully I did not butcher your name, Ben. I apologize in advance if I did.
Nope, all good, all good.
Okay, thanks, Ben. So I'll turn it over to Bob or to Ben, whoever is going to go.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank Larry. Very detailed, helpful presentation, and a lot of, stole a lot of our thunder. A lot of things in our presentation you already probably said better than what we would say. Our split really is like for Ben and I did quite a bit of the work here. So I was more involved in the accounting side and the structural side. Ben was more on the policy, how to spend the money, and also on the reporting side. So he would be doing the quarterly reports like Larry mentioned. And why don't you flip to the next slide, please? Okay, there's a lot of details here. We'll probably be following the same process for the ARP funding, and we felt it was rather straightforward. And working with our controller's office who does our cash management, these things were all established, and we received the $160 million on April 23rd. And like Larry said, we did the same thing. We initially put in deferred revenue, and it's deemed to be earned revenue once money is spent, for a valid purpose. Let's go to the next slide, please. So our thought process was that we've had two major, snow events, of October 2006 storm and November 2014 storm. Both were major events and both involved FEMA. And our thought process was that this is such a major endeavor here, and we chose to basically create a new special revenue fund to record this funding in and track all the funding in it. it allowed us on our end to have all, county departments and units, you spend this money, and it would easily track it. It was good for developing reports, not really no special programming required. And we work with our controller's office. They set up a special investment, so all unspent proceeds are earning interest and basically increasing the amount we can spend on the program. The big issue we had is, like, again, initially it was set up for spending through December 30th of 2020. So the thought process, you make some decisions at that point, trying to get everything spent by December 30th of 2020. So when the spending was extended into 21, we basically, some charges we recorded in that fund, we just backed out because we had certainly needs for the funding in 21. So some costs were backed out and put back in the general fund, and we carried forward over like 30 million over of the 160 into 21 to continue, COVID work and help us deal with this crisis. I'd say go with the next slide, please. Yeah, we work with every county department, so it's, they would often say, we could use this for, first of all, we need a solution. Does it qualify under CRF? We do the research and determine, well, first of all, does it qualify? And secondly, does the county want to spend the money on this program? So a lot of things were done. And as you can see on the slide there, like virtual learning centers, at small business assistance, we passed on money to help our local municipalities and schools that incurred COVID costs. Some money was given to our community college to help them, recoup some of their COVID costs. So it was a lot of sharing took place. It wasn't all just county expenditures where we received benefit. We received benefit collectively as a county, but in a lot of cases, the money was shared with other parts of the county. Want to go to the next slide, please? Okay, and like it says there, it's like we use, like, BOCES was involved in some cases, and Tourism Bureau. And the subrecipients, we need to, Ben, maybe you can clarify more on the subrecipient issues.
Yeah, so with this piece here, we knew it would be it could be a burdensome reporting process if we had a huge array of subrecipients. And also, we wanted to protect the county as much as possible from problems associated with fraud. And I guess as a tertiary issue, the county does not have the manpower to administer a huge array of grant programs on its own. So we tried to work with downstream partners to both protect the county and help manage these programs. So we would work with a large entity. So for instance, with our virtual learning centers, where if kids were either fully virtual or split days, but both parents had to work, provide a place for them to go. So we worked with the BOCES programs, the two in Erie County, to help administer that and enter into contracts and set up the facilities themselves. So we only have a handful of contracts with large entities who then themselves had dozens of subcontracts with subrecipients to actually manage the program, and that helped protect the county a little bit. We also were very careful in the contracts with all subrecipients, where they're required to guarantee compliance with all provisions of the CARES Act, to acknowledge that they have their own responsibility to comply with the eventual federal audit, and also to indemnify the county in the event that the feds find there is misappropriation or non-compliance with the CARES Act. And so we'll eventually be able to seek recovery if we have to pay Treasury back for misspent funds, that we can down the line recover those funding for ourselves. And we worked with our county attorney to ensure that was in place for every subcontract.
Next slide, please. Again, Larry kind of touched on this a bit, but initially that was, the money comes in March of 2020, and the detail was sketchy, and it's constantly reviewing the updates to the detail, and always as requests came in to spend money, and We just got to make sure, is this cost eligible under the CARES Act? You know, and so again, many conference calls, and I think we're in a good place now. But it was a kind of a cumbersome process. Next slide, please. So Ben, why don't you cover the quarterly reporting aspect?
Sure. So I'll say the thing that makes quarterly reporting so much easier was the original decision on Bob's part to create a separate fund to house all the CRF money. So it makes it easy for us to pull all the relevant information segregated from any other county spending for the reports. And that was, I think, a key decision that makes it easier for us. So everything is managed through the Federal Grant Solutions process. And it works out pretty well. It's a fully browser-based system. I would expect for ARP, it's going to be probably a very similar process where that's a login. They basically have a number of subsections in the reporting process where you will report out any pays above $50,000 for contracts, grants, loans, transfers to other municipal agencies, and also direct pays. With a fairly high level of detail with all those, they want to know what kind of project it was spent on, what the goal of the project was, as well as all of the contact information for where the money was spent. If at all possible, they love it when you have the DUNS number, either for any other municipality you gave money to, or for many large vendors have DUNS numbers too that have any sort of federal work. That makes things a lot easier if you can pull those DUNS numbers. Otherwise, they want your own internal vendor ID number. And then also there was, I think, as the folks in Westchester mentioned, the general aggregate reporting for any payments below $50,000, and also payments to individuals. So we were, I think, surprised at first that they didn't want that much detail. So for aggregate payments to individuals, all of the overtime payments or the payments to employees who were substantially dedicated to COVID-19, it just all got lumped together into a single large sum. But that's how it went. So that was actually a little simpler than we expected, but it works well. And the folks that run the Grant Solutions helpline are really good. And any technical problems we had or issues, they were able to resolve, within a half hour or so typically. So very good customer support from Treasury for the program.
Next slide, please. And I can just say from the Erie County perspective, we're going through an external audit for 2020 right now, and the auditors promised me that starting Monday they're going to be reviewing this new COVID fund and also the single audit. So, it'll be a real good test to see how well we did, and the one benefit is that since the fund does extend into, the funding extends into 21, if there are some costs that they feel are not eligible, we would just back them out, charge them to general, and then carry that funding into 21. So it's a very daunting process, and again, like the slide says, they do follow up on, OIG does follow up. We have a couple of discussions with them on various funding questions, and it went very well. Ben, anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, just the first bullet point here with OIG oversight. We had an experience where someone was complaining about how we had spent some money on essentially food for people manning the vaccine clinics. And we did, sure enough, get an email from OIG following up and wanting to have a conference call and go through the documentation. So just be aware, even though there's a lot of people getting the money, OIG is on top of stuff. I think for the CRF program, OIG was awarded $40 million from Congress to manage oversight, and I think the figure is substantially higher for ARP. So they have a lot of, they're hiring like crazy, I think, and putting teams into place. So, certainly be very diligent.
Okay, basically, in summary, thanks for asking us to speak, and we're happy to answer any questions at the end of the session. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you so much, Bob and Ben. We're now going to turn it over to Suffolk County for to share their experience. Originally, we were going to have Eric Naughton, the budget director from Suffolk, speak, but Eric is moving on to leaving county government. It's a great loss there. So we have Angela Cole here today to talk a little bit about what happened at Suffolk and their experience. Thank you, Angela.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Am I allowed to say ditto to Erie and Westchester? We basically did I'd say almost the same kind of procedures and processes that both of those counties did. When we had initially were awarded the CRF money, we did the same thing. We put it into a balance sheet account, and it was in an interest-bearing account. So we did earn, a couple $100,000 extra in interest to be able to spend towards COVID expenses. So that was, obviously a bonus. But we also had anticipated spending the full funds through December 30th. Because of that, because of the short time frame, we really focused on, using what we could within the county. So, about 90% of our CRF funds were spent towards, dedicated staff for public health and public safety, or substantially, staff that kind of was pulled in from other departments to assist with those COVID initiatives. So one of the biggest challenges that we ran into was, just kind of tracking the costs initially, just to try to figure out, how we wanted to spend them on anything else. But like I think Westchester had said, the administrative burden relief of, being able to say that the public health staff and the public safety staff are substantially dedicated, and we didn't have to really pull in too much tracking for that. That was a big help for us. But we also did set up a special code for our expenditures in our financial system to track the COVID expenses. So we've been able to run reports to see, what expenses were paid for. We did recognize some revenue related to telework costs from our IT department because, as I'm sure it was the case for everybody, it was all of a sudden everybody had to start working from home, and we weren't really set up to do so. So they really had to pull through and incurred a lot of costs related to that, and also to set up, business remotely, since the public wasn't allowed to come into the buildings anymore. So we incurred, a substantial amount for that cost as well. One of the other things that we used our CRF funds for was we had incurred additional costs related to borrowing for our revenue anticipation notes. So we had double checked with the Treasury to make sure, because the guidance specifically mentioned TAN borrowing, but not necessarily RAN borrowing. So we had double checked with the Treasury, and they said that that was fine as well. So we figured out what our typical borrowing was, on an annual basis, and what the difference was for this year. And so we took, percentage allocation for those costs that we incurred. And one of the things that, we kind of our motto is we just document exactly, what we did and why we did it. And hopefully that will, be okay once OIG comes around to audit this. And I guess I just want to say one of the other kind of issues that we ran into was we got the CRF funds. We also got about, I think it was about $52 million in other CARES / COVID related grants. So I don't want to say the funds were a shell game, but it kind of was, like Larry has said, we tried to max, FEMA is so restrictive on what they will reimburse for. So we tried to put, everything that we possibly could towards FEMA, and then see where else we could pick it up, between the CRF or the grants that we got. We got a couple $1 million specifically for public health for grants like contact tracing, and we had to hire a lot of temp nursing staff to assist us with our efforts. So, we're just kind of trying to figure out where we could possibly spend the money in the best way to maximize our reimbursement efforts. So, and we're still doing that. We did report all of the funds as obligated not necessarily paid through the end of the fourth quarter, but obligated, because we had initially thought we were going to have to spend it through the end of the year. So that's what we planned on. So, and like I think Larry had said, it's now we can kind of move on to the next, pot of money and the ARF funds and worry about those. So while I'm happy to see the CRF kind of reporting done, I know it'll never, go away. We can focus on FEMA and ARF. It's definitely been interesting to say the least. But yeah, I think, I'm glad to hear that our experiences are the same, are the same within the other counties. It makes me feel a little bit better about what we have done. So a little bit of relief to know that we are, doing the same sort of efforts and reporting and ideas. So I'm happy to hear that. So, but I think that's about it. I don't think we have anything a little, different than that.
Thank you, Angela. We have time for questions now. We have a few questions in here, and I'll address a couple of them. There's a question about the handout and the slide deck. The slide deck will be posted on the website later today. There's a question here about, will the state eventually share some portion of their $5.1 billion in CRF funds? And I think the answer to that, because we've asked the executive multiple times, is no. They have spent all that money, or they have a plan to spend all that money. So I don't think there's going to be anything distributed to smaller counties out of that. And there's another question about whether the comptroller might send out some guidance to account for the ARP funds. That's a question for OSC, and we'll reach out to them. But I think the folks here have laid out a pretty big plan as to how to account for this funding. But the ARP funds might be a little bit different based on the spending purposes. So there's another question. I had a question too. I think Erie mentioned that they had 30 million that they are essentially carrying over for 2021 needs. For Suffolk and Westchester, even though you said the funds are obligated, in a way, do you have carryover for 2021?
So this is Larry. Yeah, so we ended up increasing our fund balance at the end of 2020. I mean, we haven't closed the books yet. It's not official, but we will end up increasing our fund balance. So essentially, our 2021 budget relied on drawing down a significant portion of that fund balance, to cover the gap that we had. Now that we obviously didn't know about ARP at that point in time, but now that we have ARP, that hopefully we'll be able to use some of that for budgetary relief and not end up drawing down. So, I mean, in essence, that's how we carried it over. There was no prohibition in terms of, in the CARES Act or any of the guidance as far as, that you couldn't, because we did use the funds for eligible expenses. And, in the end, that resulted in that we didn't necessarily have to use other funds. So we did increase our fund balance.
Yeah, for Erie County, we had like $4 million that was basically committed at year-end 20, which we did. We carried that also over 21, in addition to the free and clear balance. So that was like 26 million of free and clear balance, and then 4 million of items committed. So we can actually spend 30 million in 21.
Thanks, Robert. Angela? Suffolk?
Ours is all fully in 2020. Even though I didn't report it as paid, it was it's obligated, and so it's charged to our 13th period. So it still goes back to fiscal year 2020, though. So.
Okay. And another question is, we talked a lot about process. Just if each of you could talk about what was the bulk of your CRF spending for? I think I know for Westchester and Suffolk that it may have went towards payroll, but if that's not the case, what was your second biggest expenditure if the bulk of it was for your payroll expenses?
Well, I'll hop in for Erie and say that the bulk of our expenditures were actually childcare. various child care programs to confront that challenge. But the bulk of our money went out externally, either the small business grants, rental assistance, grants to school districts and towns and cities, and then again, a lot of child care spending.
Yeah, the child care is roughly about 19 million of that was spent in 20.
Was that contracted out or?
There were various pots there. So there was our virtual learning center program that was contracted out. We also provided from the county directly to child care providers a subsidy when they had a hard cap on the number of kids that could be enrolled and they were not able to make a profit during that period to sort of subsidize them. And we also we added funding in for the direct payments to families to subsidize child care as well.
Okay.
Yeah, Dave, as far as Westchester, I mean, we spent about $40 million on non-personal service related items, which would have included, you know, all of our programmatic initiatives, remote learning centers, food insecurity, in addition to small business assistance. As I mentioned, we spent $18 million on grants to small businesses. So the balance of it would have been, you know, and in addition, we utilized other sources of funding as well. We, you know, had $9.4 million in projects that we applied to FEMA for. Some funding just was paid for out of the general fund because essentially funds are somewhat fungible. If you know, use this for other expenses, that frees up money. So essentially about 130 million, I'd say, out of the total was spent on personal service.
Thanks, Larry.
Yep.
And for Suffolk, it was about 92% of our award related to the substantially dedicated staff. We did spend we are going to report about 4% for leave. You know, people that were on quarantine nobody was laid off as a result. So people that were quarantined or people that could not do their work at home. That equals about 4% of our total award with salaries and fringe. And then the other was the telework and the small amount for the RAN, interest and administrative costs.
Okay. Yeah, I think you may have addressed this a little bit, but we had another question coming in. And how did each of you finish the year overall in your general fund?
Well, from Erie, we actually, after initially the shock of the bad sales tax numbers in the late spring, we actually finished with a small surplus in 20.
Okay.
In Suffolk, I can't answer that question. We actually are still closing the books.
All right.
Yeah. I mean, I can't give exact numbers for Westchester, but we will end up with adding to our, I think I mentioned it earlier, to our fund balance at the end of 2020.
Okay. Thanks. I don't see any more questions here from the group. I do have one more. What are you thinking for ARP funding? I know we don't have guidance yet, but is there something you wanted to do under the CRF that you couldn't do and you think is something you're going to be looking at more closely with the ARP funding? And it is a longer time frame too. We have 4 years to spend out those funds. So I'm assuming you're already thinking about it, but is there some unmet need that you couldn't address with CRF that might be a good candidate here with the ARP funds when they do become available? Whoever wants to jump in.
For Erie, we took fairly significant deficit remediation steps mid-year because of a charter requirement. And now that the economy is recovering, a lot of those are going to prove to be unnecessary. And so the ARP funding, particularly the provision that lets you make up for lost revenue due to COVID, we hope to restore a lot of those cuts we had to make.
Yeah, that's, oh, sorry. That's exactly the same for Suffolk. The ability to use it for revenue loss is a huge game changer for us.
Yeah, I think we're kind of waiting for the guidance to come out to see if they're going to allow us to adjust our base year for purposes of determining revenue loss. I mean, obviously we have revenue loss in certain areas, parks and so forth, but that's not the bulk of it. So I think we're kind of waiting, but I think in terms of conversations that we have taken place so far, I certainly think we'll continue additional business assistance. Obviously the local municipalities, cities, towns, villages are getting money directly, so are the school districts. So, we may still continue remote learning centers depending on when schools reopen. And we have a separate bucket of money for rental assistance, so we don't really need to use this money for that, which is, which is certainly a need. So that we're having those conversations now, and that was the exact question that came up in a meeting the other day. What needs do we have that have not been met that we can address? So we're still working through that and waiting for the guidance.
Yeah, and another question came in, and I think one of you mentioned this. How far behind are you? Has any of you gotten a reimbursement from FEMA at all on anything, or are you substantially behind or waiting with them on issues? Or
yeah, so for us, we have about 9 projects submitted. We have not been approved for one of them yet. I mean, so we started the process probably, summer last year, and so it's been rather arduous, let's put it that way. We think we're close on a couple, but then they come back. Like, for example, we put in water was one of our claims for emergency services, and then they wanted to get receipts for the bottle deposits that were included in there. I mean, it's just, so I think someone mentioned the level of detail that they want is amazing. So no, we haven't. Not only have we not received money, but we haven't had any of our projects approved yet.
For Erie County, we received such negative feedback on the FEMA process from the New York State Emergency Services folks. We opted to just rely solely on CRF funding for all of our COVID needs.
For Suffolk, we have only submitted one project worksheet so far, and that's the reason why it has been such a nightmare. We started it as an expedited project back in the summertime for PPE only, just PPE. We figured that was the easiest, low-lying fruit, and it has just been a nightmare. They are going through everything with a fine-tooth comb. I wish that we had CRF funds left to just use that instead. So, and we're just about to start with the vaccine administration project worksheet too. But we did hire a consultant to help us with the FEMA worksheets. We haven't really tapped into them too much yet, but I plan on doing so in the very near future.
Thank you. Yeah, we've heard from NACO and across the country in regard to FEMA that some of the counties, some of the states shared their CRF funds down to the local level. That didn't happen here in New York, but most states actually shared a little bit. And we did hear, anecdotal evidence that a lot of counties didn't want to deal with FEMA at all. And they used their CRF funds to cover some of their FEMA expenses just because it was less of a headache. And I think we all know you've all had natural disasters, and you're still not reimbursed for some of the stuff that was pretty easy to quantify and identify. And now FEMA has to deal with every municipality in every state in the country. I mean, this could be a very long process on the FEMA side. Another question came in, I know we might not know, but for any of the counties that want to jump in, it's who are the decision makers within your organization who will be deciding how you will spend your ARP funds? I'm assuming they're getting at, is the legislature going to get involved, or is there something else going on? And I know locally here, I'm in Albany here, the city is putting up a task force to decide some of the best uses of funds. So maybe you're not that far enough down the path, but do we have any idea there?
I don't know if I'm at liberty to talk specifics, but I do know that it will be different this go around than the last time. I mean, we were obviously in the throes of the height of the pandemic last time, so there wasn't a lot of outside focus on how we were going to spend this money. I think that's going to be different this time around. I do think that the legislature will have some suggestions, and I do think that we may look at some kind of a public process, perhaps setting up task forces in different specific areas to get public input. So I think that's certainly something we're considering at this point.
Thank you, Larry.
For Erie, we've been soliciting proposals from our departments, and in particular our sewage management folks, given that water, sewer, and broadband are unlimited spending options under ARP. But everything will require legislative approval ultimately.
Thank you, Erie.
And for Suffolk, we've just had very preliminary talks at this point as to what what we'll spend it on. Anything that requires appropriations to the funds, obviously the legislature will have to approve.
But I'm not seeing any other questions. There's a kind of a housekeeping question. Was there a survey we need to complete for the CPE credit? And Jeanette, I don't know if you're on, could you answer that?
Absolutely. So if you click on the handouts tab of your dashboard, you'll see that there are 2 downloadable files. So if you want to download the County Finance School Office of the State Comptroller CPE form, you can click on it and click on where it says choose file, then click on the file that you want. And you can go through the download process. It'll download it for you automatically, and then you just save it to your computer. But they're both embedded in the program. But if you have any questions at any time about the handouts, you can call or email me at jstanziano@nysac.org. Or you can just call NYSAC at 518-465-1473 and ask for extension 205. And I'd be happy to send you any of these documents directly. Just need you to call me or email me, and I'd be happy to do so. But it is right here on this link right now when you can download it. So just look for your handouts tab.
Thank you, Jeanette. I think it's time for us to close. We're hitting up against the hour. A closing remark here, we are going to have another session near the end of May, because we don't know when the ARP guidance is going to come out from Treasury. From the Bonadeo group is going to go through their analysis once we have some Treasury guidance to see how they're interpreting some of this. Because I think we're going to have the same issue we had with the CRF guidance up front. Is it's not always clear what they're saying, but we are hearing that we should see something in 3 or 4 weeks, at least some initial guidance out there. And in closing, and I'll just a last shout out to the 3 counties. Thank you so much for providing your own story on how you dealt with this. And we're in a very different place a year after this really all started. But there is long-term issues we're going to have to deal with. And this last question it's more of a comment. I mean, do you think the most popular use of ARP funds will be for revenue loss? And I think Larry pointed out he's sort of in a quandary with the rate change. But I just throw that out there. I don't know. We really need to see the guidance, I think, to see how flexible it's going to be. Open to any comments there.
Well, again, the revenue loss aspect it gives us the most flexibility. That's something where, like Erie County, where we calculated about 30 million of lost revenue in 20 due to related to COVID, and that's very, very clear on our end. So that should be a help to us in 21.
So, Bob, did you compare that to what you budgeted or your actual dollar decline?
It was actually the dollar decline compared to the prior year, and only in cases where the accounts were, I mean, sales tax we definitely could say is COVID, like our hotel tax, like our property tax collections are way down because we couldn't have a foreclosure sale. There were all things like that, things where there was the process was different because of COVID, and limitations on what people could do.
Yeah, I would say, David, if we're able to do it versus, the comparison versus plan, then we certainly will use some of that. But I think we're going to balance it, depending on how much we need for budgetary relief. But again, it really depends on the guidance and how much flexibility they're going to give us in terms of calculating the revenue loss.
Thanks, Larry. In the closing comment from Suffolk County.
The revenue loss is something that we're really looking into to find out the guidance. I think it'll really depend on what they figure is the revenue loss. What is their term? So we're really keeping our eyes open for that guidance because it'll change what amount we'll be able to report as such. So
thank you so much.
Waiting on bated breath for that.
Yes. So thank you again, speakers, and for those attending, and for our sponsor, McGinnis and Associates. We appreciate your support. It's 11:15 o'clock here, so I think it's a wrap. Thank you all.
We'd also like to thank the Office of the State Comptroller, who are co-sponsors and integral to the County Finance School. We have partnered with them for many, many years on the County Finance School, but we want to especially thank them last year and this year for being so adaptable to running a virtual program and for certifying a lot of added sessions that NYSAC added for CPE credit. So we really appreciate the State Comptroller's partnership with NYSAC on this entire program. Thank you and have a wonderful day.